There are some stories that begin not with a scream, not with a chase, and not with anything that looks unusual from the outside. They begin with a quiet invitation, a table set for lunch, a small country town, a family gathering that, to anyone passing by, might have seemed ordinary. On a winter afternoon in regional Victoria, 4 guests arrived at a home expecting a meal, conversation, and perhaps a careful step toward easing old tensions. They were older, familiar to one another, and connected by marriage, faith, family history, and years of shared life. The meal was homemade. The setting was private, and when the guests left that house, the true shape of what had happened was not yet clear. Within days, 3 people would be gone. A 4th would survive, but only after a long and serious medical ordeal. The woman who cooked the lunch would insist it had been a terrible accident. Investigators, however, would begin to look closely at the food, the phones, the messages, the movements, and the story told in the days after the meal. What followed became one of Australia's most closely watched modern criminal cases, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. Because it happened in a kitchen. Because it involved people who had trusted the person serving them. And because, long after the lunch plates had been cleared away, the question remained simple and deeply unsettling. Was this a tragic mistake, or had someone planned a meal meant to harm? Tonight, we are looking at the case of Erin Trudy Patterson, the woman convicted over what became known around the world as the Leongatha mushroom lunch case. This is a calm, true crime story for sleep, told in a steady, respectful way. There will be no graphic detail, no sensational retelling, and no attempt to turn real people's suffering into spectacle. The people at the center of this case were Don and Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson, and Ian Wilkinson. They were family members, community members, and loved ones. 3 of them did not come home from hospital. 1 survived. The facts in this episode are based on public court reporting and official updates. Erin Patterson has maintained her innocence, and, as of June 2026, her appeal is scheduled to be heard in August 2026. So settle in. Let the story unfold slowly. And we'll begin in the hills of South Gippsland, where a small town became the center of a case that drew attention far beyond Australia. Leongatha is a town in South Gippsland, Victoria, surrounded by farmland, rolling green country, and the kind of roads that feel far away from the noise of the city. It was there that Erin Patterson lived. By 2023, Erin was separated from her husband, Simon Patterson. Though their marriage had ended, she remained connected to his family. His parents, Don and Gail Patterson, were still part of that wider family circle. Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and Heather's husband, Ian Wilkinson, were also close to the family. The group were not strangers. They were not random guests. They were people linked through years of relationship, faith, and family. Don and Gail Patterson were remembered as active members of their community. Heather and Ian Wilkinson were also deeply connected to their church and local life. Ian was a pastor. Heather was his wife and partner in that life of service. In late July 2023, Erin invited Don, Gail, Heather, and Ian to lunch at her home in Leongatha. Simon Patterson was also invited, but he did not attend. That absence would later become one of many details examined by the public and by investigators. Though the lunch went ahead without him. The dish Erin served was beef Wellington, a meal often associated with care and preparation. It is not a casual sandwich or a quick soup. It takes time. It has layers. It is the kind of dish that can look warm, generous, and thoughtful on a winter table. But within that meal, prosecutors later argued, was something deadly. The Crown case was that the lunch contained death cap mushrooms and that Erin had deliberately served them to her guests. Erin's defense said the poisoning was accidental, During the trial, she accepted that the meal contained death cap mushrooms, but denied intentionally harming anyone. That difference between accident and intent became the heart of the case. A terrible accident can still destroy lives, but murder requires something more. It requires proof, beyond reasonable doubt, that the accused caused the deaths deliberately, with the necessary state of mind under the law. And so, after the lunch, after the hospitalizations, and after the deaths, the investigation began to move through ordinary details with extraordinary care. Phone records, internet activity, a discarded food dehydrator, statements made to police, earlier messages, the food served at the table, the portions, the plates, the story of where the mushrooms came from. Each detail, on its own, might have seemed small. Together, prosecutors said, they formed a pattern. The lunch took place in July 2023 at Erin Patterson's home in Leongatha. The guests were Don and Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson, and Ian Wilkinson. After the meal, all four guests became seriously unwell. Don, Gail, and Heather later died. Ian survived. The deaths were linked to death cap mushroom poisoning. Public reporting from the case described the lunch as beef Wellington containing poisonous mushrooms, and the jury later convicted Erin Patterson of murdering Don Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson, and attempting to murder Ian Wilkinson. For a sleep-friendly telling, we do not need to linger on the medical details. What matters is the quiet sequence. A meal was served. 4 guests became gravely ill. 3 lives ended. 1 person survived, and the woman who had prepared the food became the focus of a criminal investigation. At first, the public knew only fragments. There had been a family lunch, there had been mushrooms, there had been deaths, and there was a question about whether the person who cooked the meal had also eaten it. Erin told authorities that she had become unwell too, though the prosecution later argued that her level of illness was different from that of her guests. As the investigation progressed, police examined what Erin said about the mushrooms. She initially gave accounts that later became important at trial. According to reporting from the proceedings, she acknowledged she had lied about some matters, including aspects of mushroom foraging, but said the poisoning itself was accidental. The prosecution's position was very different. They alleged the meal had been built around deception. They argued that Erin had deliberately included the poisonous mushrooms and served them to the guests. They also pointed to conduct after the lunch, including the disposal of a dehydrator as part of what they said was incriminating behavior. The defense asked the jury to see the case differently. They argued there was no clear motive and that the poisoning could have been a tragic mistake. They emphasized that Erin had also gone to hospital and had denied intending to harm anyone. In a courtroom, those two possibilities cannot simply sit side by side forever. The jury has a difficult task. They must listen, they must weigh, they must put aside emotion, and then they must decide whether the prosecution has proved its case beyond reasonable doubt. Investigators were not only looking at the lunch, they were looking at the story around the lunch. In cases involving alleged poisoning, the physical evidence can be difficult. Food may be gone. Time may have passed. People may have cleaned up, thrown things away, or moved through the normal routines that follow a meal. So the investigation widened. One important item was a food dehydrator. Public trial reporting said prosecutors relied on evidence connected to a discarded dehydrator and alleged it supported their case that poisonous mushroom material had been handled before the lunch. There were also digital questions. Investigators examined phone data, online material, and other records. At trial, evidence and arguments included phone movements, online mushroom-related information, and the broader pattern of Erin's conduct before and after the lunch. Some of these categories later became part of her appeal arguments, with her legal team challenging whether certain evidence should have been admitted. The prosecution did not need to prove a motive. That is important. In true crime storytelling, motive often feels central because it helps listeners understand why something happened. But in law, motive is not always required. The jury had to consider whether the elements of murder and attempted murder were proved, not whether they could find a neat emotional explanation for the crime. Legal commentary after the verdict noted that motive was not necessary if the required state of mind was proved. The judge gave the jury directions about how to approach the charges. According to public reporting, the jury had to consider whether Erin Patterson caused the deaths, whether she acted deliberately, whether she had the required intention, and whether there was any lawful justification or excuse. That is the quiet discipline of a criminal trial. A case that may feel emotional to the public must be reduced carefully to legal questions. What happened? Who caused it? What was intended? What can be proved? In July 2025, after a lengthy trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria, the jury returned its verdict. Erin Patterson was found guilty of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The verdict did not bring back Don, Gail, or Heather. It did not erase what Ian Wilkinson had endured, but it did mark the court's finding that the lunch was not an accident. On September 8, 2025, Justice Christopher Beale sentenced Erin Patterson to life in prison with a non-parole period of 33 years. Still, the legal story did not end there. Erin Patterson maintained her innocence. Her legal team lodged an appeal, arguing that there had been a substantial miscarriage of justice. Reported grounds included claims that cross-examination had been unfair and oppressive, and that some evidence caused unfair prejudice. At the same time, prosecutors appealed the sentence, arguing that the 33-year non-parole period was manifestly inadequate. As of June 14, 2026, both sides are waiting for the next major court chapter. The conviction appeal has been set for August 19th and 20th, 2026. The Leongatha mushroom lunch case is haunting because it turns on something ordinary: a meal, a table, an invitation, the kind of scene that belongs to family life, not criminal history. Don and Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson, and Ian Wilkinson went to lunch with someone they knew. They did not walk into a dark alley. They did not meet a stranger. They sat down in a home. That is why the case stayed with so many people. It raised questions about trust, about what can be hidden behind familiar routines, about how a quiet afternoon can become the center of a courtroom story watched across the world. For the families, the public attention could never be the main thing. The main thing was loss. Don, Gail, and Heather were real people with histories, relationships, and communities that felt their absence. Ian survived, but survival does not mean the story left him untouched. For Erin Patterson, the case now sits in the appellate courts. She remains convicted, sentenced, and imprisoned, while maintaining that the verdict should be overturned. The legal system will continue its careful process, but the emotional truth of the case is already heavy. 4 guests came to lunch. Only 1 survived. And from that quiet winter table came one of the most closely followed true crime cases in modern Australia. Sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones that begin in darkness. Sometimes they begin in daylight, with a prepared meal, with familiar faces, with a door opening, and with people stepping inside, never knowing that the afternoon ahead would be remembered for years. Thank you for listening to this calm, true crime story for sleep. May we remember Don Patterson, Gail Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson with care. And may we hold space for the surviving families and communities affected by this case. Rest gently and take care.